Hello, 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 everyone. Welcome to another fun-filled NTAC webinar. Today, we're excited to talk to you about inspiring minds, embracing the 5 E's for creative education. So today, uh, it'll be me, Chaz Sumners, presenting some information to you, as well as my wonderful and knowledgeable co-host, Brittany Stanton.
Hi, everyone. So glad you joined us for this discussion. We hope you'll find the 5 E's to be useful in your practice today.
Absolutely. There's always room for more creativity when it comes to activity planning. So here at the NTAC, our job is to help you 21st CCLC programs build capacity. And we do that a number of different ways. We do that by providing technical assistance. We do that by providing these wonderful webinars. And we do that by providing you lots of different resources that you can use in your practice. So here at the NTAC, I just want to talk briefly about our priority areas, right? So we have 7 priority areas that we're focusing on, and these are essentially what the department wants us to focus on based on feedback that we've gotten from you guys, the stuff that really impacts you and the things that you really feel like you need help with. So the main priority for NTAC is to provide capacity building across the country. And so our priority areas range from pandemic recovery to ensuring you have what you need to provide equitable access to resources. It's also a critical priority that we help you provide high quality programs. And so that means intentional program design, right? That's a great way to make sure that you can build capacity in your program. Let's come back to that building capacity because all of these priorities are meant to help you build capacity, right? But for right now, let's jump into the wonderful content that we have. So today, our objectives are to analyze some student data and really figure out what student needs are by analyzing that student data so that we can use it to inform the design of intentional activities that support those needs based on the 5E instructional. So think of intentional program design as a process of layering pieces, sort of like making a tasty lasagna that flow through the phases that we're going to talk about right now. And so the first part of intentional activity design is identifying student needs. Student needs should be incorporated into SMART goals that you're using to drive your intentional activity design. So let's talk about how we analyze student needs and we assess them, right? So when you're planning meaningful activities, your goal should be to foster connections between the school day and out of school time using that student data. You need to know what your students' needs are before you can create goals and programming to fill those needs. And the data that you collect during your needs assessment can help you discover areas for you to plan these appropriate activities. So this data can come from a bunch of different places. It can be your state assessment reports, it can be report cards or student surveys. And then through that data, we can assess different buckets of need, right? Academic, social, emotional, developmental needs. And then based on those needs, we can develop SMART goals that help inform our activity plan. So let's take a quick look at some student data and see if we can identify some critical needs. So just looking at this chart, what do you observe in this data? What does this data tell us about the needs of the students that the data was collected from? And how does knowing the needs of a student impact how we design activities? Feel free to go ahead and share in the chat box.
So Chaz, as I take a look at some of this information here, it's interesting to me that there doesn't seem to be anybody in grade 1 who is at the advanced level. And then we see an increase in grade 2 around that beginning step, a larger portion of the student body that is, hovering at a lower proficiency level. And then that kind of reverts a little bit in grade 3. And so this starts to paint a picture for me that, um, there just isn't enough, there aren't enough students that are proficient. And I start to wonder also, like, what's kind of leading into that situation. We don't have that in this, sample data here. But these are the questions that are running through my mind as I look at this data, because that's also going to be really important in the activities that are designed to be able to support, because this information is just looks like it's reading across the board. But like, what about it within that subject is it that their students are struggling with? And how can then I build activities that are going to support that? So that's one of the things that I'm kind of thinking about as I look at this sample data.
Absolutely. Yeah, it really makes me kind of want to drill down because those questions that you presented, those are really good questions that you could go to your school day partners and ask. Like you can go to literacy instructors during the school day and say, "Hey, listen, the data that we're getting says this. What are you doing, and what do you think? How can we help you support the learning surrounding literacy for your students?"
Yeah, and I also
So,
think,
oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
sorry, Chaz. I
No,
also think that like the taking that next step. So here's your blanket level data, right? To take that next step and to dive in and dig deeper and ask some deeper questions of whether that's teacher surveys or conversations or whatever it is that it may be, right? That's gonna make sure that whenever I'm developing those activities, that it's directly supporting those specific needs. And this is an important aspect, because otherwise, um, just throwing reading activities into the mix might they could be engaging, right? There's a possibility there, but is it solving the problem? Are the things that I'm building into these activities really helping students advance their proficiency? And so that's the biggest thing for me. Is that knowing those specific needs within the context of the subject that they have, so that we can design high impact activities around those specific needs. This is just a starting point. What we see here, we have to take that step and go just a little bit deeper.
that's right. Yeah, we have this data, but this data is just the beginning. It's the foundation that we're going to use to build these intentional activities that help support them. So the next step is creating SMART goals based on the data that we receive, so that we can use those for our programming. Right. So I'm sure a number of us are familiar with SMART goals, but it always bears a little bit of repeating. Right. Um, Well-developed SMART goals have 5 different components. They are specific, so the goal's clearly stated and identifies the target audience. Everyone should understand what you're trying to achieve with your SMART goal. It's also measurable, meaning that the goal is quantifiable, meaning you can see the results and you can measure the results so that you can gauge whether you're successful or not in meeting your goal. And being able to measure those results is so key, because otherwise, how do we know if we're really making progress? We also want to make sure that our goals are achievable. So, yeah, we want to make sure that we have fairly lofty goals, but we also want to make sure that they're not impossible to reach. Um, a bit of a stretch, but not so much of a stretch that we fall over, right? We also want to make sure that they're relevant. We want to make sure the goals connected with student needs and interests, as well as program goals. And using that data that we just talked about, that's how we make sure that the SMART goals that we're developing are relevant. And then last, we want to make sure they're time bound. We want to make sure that they have specific timelines and a deadline, so that we can reassess once we've, delivered something based on these SMART goals. So, as you begin writing SMART goals, think about what you want the students to be able to achieve at the end of the activity, what knowledge or skill or ability the students should be demonstrating, when they're participating, and how students will be able to demonstrate what they've learned. So let's take a minute to look at this SMART goal, right, and identify the different pieces of it. So, how is this SMART goal specific? Well, we're making sure that we are addressing students that are identified as in need and who attend our program regularly. How is it measurable? Well, we measure it by pre and post assessments. Is it achievable? How will we know? We'll know because we're using 80% of the students in need as a metric, right? That's what we're looking for. That's what our goal is. Is it relevant? Yes, it is, because it shows students will show increased proficiency in sequencing, which is, an area of deficit for them. And is it time bound? Yep, because we're measuring, the progress at the end of the activity. So, looks like this is a complete SMART goal. Let's move on to writing a SMART goal of our own. So, here's some information that we have to inform the SMART goal. What can we pull from this information to formulate each part of our SMART goal? Feel free to go ahead and share in the chat. Um, I know that we definitely want, if we're looking at specific populations, we're looking at students struggling with math that are having trouble with fractions or percentages, right? So that looks like the sort of specific part for us. What do you think, Brittany?
Yeah, I would tend to agree. The thing is, if we can begin to identify each of these aspects, the different parts of SMART, it can help us put together the puzzle pieces for that SMART goal. So to be able to pull out of this little bit of information here, something that is specific, something that is measurable, right? Just the individual pieces, we can then wordsmith and craft, into an actual statement that makes a lot of sense. So I would agree with you. Like, we see that from the information that we have, that the specific need is in fractions and percentages. So that's the relevancy right there, is that, according to the data, this is what we've seen is the needs. We also have some unknowns, some flexibility, and this is, ABC imaginary program that we're writing a SMART goal for. So we get to determine, the time boundness. Maybe it is just a unit activity that's going to take a couple weeks, and that's how long this goal is going to serve for. But maybe the problem is much deeper, and this is something we're going to have to work on the entire fall, and it's going to take a couple months or the whole school year. And so even though we have this great information, we don't necessarily have anything that's saying, oh, well, you have to, the time bound has to be in X number of weeks. We can be creative around, what we want to say regarding that. Same thing with being specific, right? In the sample that we just looked at, it was 80% of students who were attending on a regular basis. That's really important, right? You want to be sure that you're thinking about the students who are actually there are the ones that are receiving the supports. And if they're not coming to program and they're not getting the supports, are they gonna, that's another problem for another day to try to address,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. That's a whole different can of worms that we're opening there. But yes, I agree. Yeah, I mean, they need to be present to be able to receive any benefit from the instruction that we're putting together. And I do want to circle back to the flexibility that you suggested when we were talking about, being time bound, because in OST programs, you have a unique opportunity to be more flexible with that. You're not bound by the school day curriculum. So if you feel like you need to spend more or less time on something, that's something that you actually have the ability to do, and a great way that you can work collaboratively in supporting your school day partners. So,
Yeah. And sorry, Chaz, I
oh,
also want to add, I think there's a little bit of information shared here that is optional. We want to make sure that we're addressing student voice, and it's great that they're interested in medieval history, R&B, and video games. I don't know a kid that's not interested in video games, but we don't necessarily need to specifically be referencing those interests within the context of the goal, right? The activities that we then build out to support that goal might be including these different areas of interest for students, right? Because the goal is not about what their interests are, it's about the relevancy to the need. And so you could incorporate in there, that this unit is going to focus on be built on a video game concept or something like that. You could include that. Um, but I feel like for the SMART goal, it's not 100% necessary to go to that level because we want to make sure that it's holding true to SMART, right? That it's specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time bound. That it's those things. We don't necessarily need to introduce extra layers of detail within the goal. That's going to happen within the activity.
That's right. Yeah, that's where the intentional activity design comes in. So let's take a look at what a SMART goal could look like for the data that we were just analyzing. So here's a sample SMART goal. Let's identify the different areas, the different SMART parts. I really like that, Brittany. I'm gonna steal that. I'm not gonna lie. So we have specific, right? How is our goal specific? Well, students identified as in need who attend regularly are our target audience, right? How is it measurable? Well, we're talking about measuring through pre and post tests after the before and after the activity. Achievable? Looks like it. We're aiming for 80%. We're not looking for 100%. We're aiming for 80%. Is it a stretch? Yes, but it's still an achievable goal. Is it relevant? Well, it's certainly relevant because we know that the data shows that students need increased proficiency with fractions and percentages. And is it time bound? Yep, because we're tying it to the end of the unit.
You
So,
know, I
hooray, we've got a complete SMART goal.
Yeah, and I this sounds really similar to the sample from a couple of slides ago, but at the end of the day, when you've kind of mastered this SMART formula, right, and having all these different pieces, they are going to kind of start to look and feel similar, right? But that doesn't necessarily mean that they all have to go in this specific order or this framework. It's that all the pieces are there. And so, wordsmith it to fit your needs and kind of your format, and that's fine as long as it has all of these parts. The other thing is that there's a lot of grace in this particular SMART goal, right? You mentioned 80% being something that's very realistic, that we can work to achieve 80%. You might not want to be setting a SMART goal that says, 98% of your students will da 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 da, right? That's pretty lofty, especially whenever, you might have other things that you're working on, or maybe you're tackling, student attendance or engagement and things like that, right? So think very intentionally about that goal number. And then that flexibility back on the time bound piece, right? Because, things happen, right? I think about like the states that get hit heavy with snow, and it's going to throw your timeline off. And so there's a certain level of flexibility there, but it is yet still time bound. By the end of this unit, this is when we're going to be taking a look at how the students are doing. And the other thing I wanted to mention is just not everything has to be pre and post test. There's so many other ways to measure student progress. And so again, this is just an example, a sample. And you will have so many different SMART goals for so many different reasons as a 21st CCLC program. It'll be tied to your activities. It'll be tied to the program as a whole. It'll be tied to everything. And so they will look a little bit different, and that's okay. But making sure we have all those SMART parts is the most important thing.
That's right. Yeah. We just want to make sure that all of our SMART parts are there so that we can, move on to designing activities that meet these SMART goals, right? And again, you're going to be writing a bunch of these, so they're not all going to look the same, nor should they look the same, right? But these examples are just helpful to reference. So let's look at the second phase of intentional activity design. So the student needs and voice data that you collected, from the first layer will inform our second layer, which involves defining and designing different types of activities. And we want to make sure that we are engaging students and creating activities that impact their achievement based on those needs. So what types of activities could we be planning? Well, I'm glad you asked. We Yeah, there are basically six types of activities. There are a lot of types of activities, right? But right now we're limiting ourselves to six types of activities, and our deep dive today is going to go into academic and enrichment activities, particularly. But just to touch on, each of these different types of activities. So our academic activities are ones that are aligned to the school day curriculum. Our enrichment activities are ones that sort of tangentially support different aspects of our academic programming or other programming. um, College and career, that's about exposing students to different kinds of career opportunities and things that they might need to be college ready if that's the path that they want to pursue. Health and nutrition, we always want to make sure that we're providing students with activities and lessons that support their knowledge about their physical health, their mental health, nutrition, but also we want to make sure that those lessons involve things about safety, right? Personal safety, online safety, mental health safety, all of those things. Those are also important aspects of health and nutrition. We also have our recreation activities, which are very often, students' favorite activities, right? You often have students that are like, well, why can't we just do more soccer, right? Like, oh, okay, we can, but we have to balance it with the other types of activities that we're planning. Um, and it's also a sneaky way to sneak in a health or nutrition lesson while you're doing recreation activities, just saying. And then also family engagement activities, right? The fun stuff where we get to loop in not just our kiddos, but the families that love and support them and really make things feel like a community. So
And I
again,
think,
today, sorry.
no, I keep just these light bulbs are going off, Chads, as you're speaking. Yeah, I love that recreation can also be a way to talk about like health and wellness. But, I think about like math ball and how
Ah,
you can
yes.
make uh activities that are kind of crossing the lines in the different
Mhm.
types here, right? Like a math activity that's also physical, that's a recreational. How great is that? Or like college and career readiness, just talking about life skills and things that will follow them beyond, their school days is
Yeah, those
something
soft
that's
skills.
also
Yeah.
important, right? And so we think, college and career, like, oh, that's the formal, like, what's the FAFSA, writing a college essay, da 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 da,
Yeah.
right? But it could be so much more. And again, that's a subject for another day because today we're going to focus, like you said, on just the academic and enrichment kind of aspects.
That's right. So, I mean, and it would be fun to do webinars on all these different activity types. And I mean, that could be something in the future that we could do. And if that's something that you'd like to see from us, make sure that you include that on the feedback forms that, we present at the end of these webinars, right? Because again, all of these topics are informed by the feedback that we get from you guys, letting us know where you feel like you need help and support. So let's move on to the third phase of intentional activity design. Once you've gone through identifying your student needs and designing some different types of activities, you're going to want to vary your method of delivery, right? You want to select appropriate delivery methods to ensure that each activity achieves its activity level goal. Following this layered approach that we've presented here will help you engage your students and impact student achievement positively. Uh, it's important when you're designing activities to target the areas of weakness that or the areas that students feel like they need support. In the same way that we're doing that here for you guys, based on the feedback, you're doing it for your students based on the student needs that you've identified and then the activities that you've developed.
Yeah, and I think that like this three phase of intentional activity design is I remember being in programs, leading programs, and this kind of being the bread and butter of the process, right? That and if you've been on some of the NTAC webinars recently, I know that sometimes I feel like I start to repeat myself after times, but it's so true
Right.
that like we are constantly going through this cycle of identifying student needs, then designing the activities, and then assessing their impact. And you have to keep repeating the cycle. And so breaking it down to these three phases is really, I think, helpful. And always going back to that spot of like reassessing and identifying what those current needs are is going to be, you're going to frequent that area a lot. And
Yeah.
that's totally anticipated in the world of 21st century programming.
Absolutely, yeah. Sort of the iterative nature of this process, right? But that's what you do. You address it, then you reassess, and then you adapt, and then you move forward and just keep continuing this cycle. And that's how we can positively support our kids.
So now that we're finally at this phase of, okay, we can plan some activities, there's a couple things we want you to consider. And today we're focusing on just one model of building out different kinds of activities. And this is the 5E instructional model. And why is it that we're talking about this today? Some of you might have heard of the 5Es. Some of you might not have heard of the 5Es. If you are familiar, feel free to let us know in the chat if this resonates with you or if it's something new that you're learning. But just a little background on the 5Es and why it is a great approach for our setting in the out of school time space, right? It is constructivist. So this means that the whole model, the 5E model, is based on constructivist theory. Constructivism comes from the belief that learners construct their own meaning actively rather than through passive information gathering. And constructivist instruction gives students those opportunities to ask questions, to discuss. The hands-on learning experiences are part of this, and engage meaningfully in that new content, which is what we want in the OST space, right? So we think of, if you reflect on a time when you were in more of like a lecture style class, right? Perhaps if your college days attended a few lectures, I'm sure, right? That's really passive, right? It is not necessarily engaging in these ways. And so that doesn't really fit in the OST space, right? They've already had some of that during the school day. We need to do something different in the OST space. And hopefully they are doing, to a certain extent, right, some hands-on things in the science classes, and they're doing active discussions in school. But here we have the opportunity to really break that mold and get out of the box. And that's where the 5Es can be really, really helpful in making sure that we are building out activities that are going to allow students to go through these different ways of learning. It's also research has shown also that this 5E instructional model is highly effective for developing conceptual knowledge. So not just memorizing facts, or you think of students who are trying to learn their spelling words, or they've got to define X number of terms, or and memorize the definitions, right? Those are, we need to learn words. We need to learn how to spell. Those are important things. But what's special about this 5E instructional model is that it goes way beyond all of that, right? And using this model helps your students to make deeper connections to the content that you're taking. And ultimately, that's where like the true deep learning happens, right? Because you can read a passage and be like, great, I read that. Or you can build out activities based on that reading that's going to help them dig out the whys and the hows, and have them analyzing and guessing and so many wonderful things that, it gets them critically thinking and asking those questions. And that's what we want to do for our students, is we want to support them as they become critical thinkers. So this instructional model can really help whenever planning those activities, so that you're touching in all these different ways and trying to dig into all the different ways of learning. So what are the 5Es? Well, these 5Es, as you see on the screen here: engage, explore, explain, elaborate, and evaluate. So this is a phase model, and it was initially designed really for inquiry-driven science instruction. And so for any of my science buffs out there, if it's feeling sciencey, that's why. But it can also be applied in any context for student-centered hands-on learning. So today, we're going to walk through each of these E's. We're going to provide you with a variety of example activities that might support these different phases of the 5 E's. And then we'll try to wrap it all together and put a nice little bow on it at the end, so you can kind of see like how these all go together in the form of a unit to support a SMART goal. So let's start with number 1. Let's engage. So engagement activities occur at the introduction. It's at the beginning of the unit to get students excited and interested in whatever it is that they're about to learn about, right? It gets them excited about whatever activities you're going to be working on. And so the ultimate goals for engagement activities are to activate any prior knowledge that students might have. We want to prompt students to make connections to things that they already know about, and specifically how those things that they know about might be tied to the subject they're about to focus on. That will give them the basis for learning this new topic that you want to introduce. So an activity could be something like KWL, or Know, Wonder, Learn charts, right? Or concept maps. There's so many different activities that you can do to activate that prior knowledge. This phase also, as we mentioned, is like the introduction. It's that first touch point for the content. So you're not just going to explain, but you're also going to show students what they're learning about. So present the content in exciting ways, not through that, that lecture, right? You don't want to just talk to them about it, right? Methods to introduce content could be things like short videos, or sharing an artifact, or maybe there's like a little challenge to get them thinking about things. All those are great ways to introduce the content in a more exciting, engaging way. You'll also, in this phase, question assumptions. So you'll want to make sure that you identify any misconceptions that students have and anything they believe about whatever the topic is. So starting with activities where you're going to ask questions that really get them thinking, intriguing questions, right? This is also an outcome of using KWL charts, right? That wonder. What is it that you know? What do you wonder? What could you learn? And there's many things that you can kind of tailor to make sure that you're asking questions that are getting them to start to think about things, right? And then we want to spark curiosity, right? So in this beginning phase, we want them to get excited about the topic. We want them to engage in new learning. And so activities could be something like an inquiry lab, or demonstration, or case studies. And so I have a suggestion here from Sean that once did a math lesson where I had iPads scattered around the room with Angry Birds space loaded on them and a sign that said, "Play me." The kids started playing immediately. That was the hook to ask student questions about gravity, parabolic curves, arcs, angles, speed, and more.
Love
And
that.
what kid didn't like Angry Birds? Good grief. They're still playing Angry Birds, right?
Mm-hmm.
So here's another activity idea for you. We call this to react or not to react. And so this is an activity that maybe you'd be doing to introduce chemical reactions. And so students would get to experiment with mixing baking soda and vinegar to observe how they react, and adjust the quantities to see how the reactions differ, right, between more or less of each ingredient. And that can be a really great way to spark that curiosity about reactants and get them thinking about how, when I mix things together safely, because that's a huge piece of
Yeah.
science, right? We want to make sure that we are also promoting safety. Um, but it's a really cool activity. And, I think about those science fairs where, you make your volcano, and there's a lot of ways that you could use something like this to spark that curiosity about the subject that you want to work on. Um, so I mentioned that doing a mind map is another great way to get students thinking about a subject. And so we're going to take a moment and we're going to do this together, actually. So if you have a piece of paper and pencil close by, grab that. And if you're not familiar, mind mapping is a visualization activity where you are working to make connections between different concepts before going deeper into a particular subject. And so in our lightning round of mind mapping today, our subject is going to be butterflies. And so at the center of your map, you're going to write butterflies. And you can do this on paper, you can do this digitally. There's so many different things that you could do, right? You could do this in groups, you could do it in partners. There's so many variety of ways to approach this. But take a moment and I want you to brainstorm as many things as you can in the next like 30 seconds about butterflies. I'm thinking back to, oh gosh, was it first grade? It might have been first grade, Chaz, where
Mm,
we collected I just remember the containers, right? And we learned about monarch butterflies, and we
yep.
had a caterpillar, and then there's like the chrysalis happening, and I remember all these things from whenever I was in elementary school, going through that, learning about the life cycle of a butterfly.
Such a fun way to engage. Oh, the very hungry caterpillar too. I see
Yes.
that coming in. Yeah, it's funny because the first thing that pops into my mind whenever somebody says butterflies is reading Rainbow, just because of the song,
Ah,
"Butterfly in the Sky," like that. And so it's weird because it also sort of ties into literacy, which you would not expect. But again, that shows you just how these connections, like how vague these connections can be sometimes, and just how things can be connected in your mind. Because I mean,
so
this mind map, I'm sorry, Brittany.
no, go ahead.
I was just going to say this mind map is just basically the same way our brains work, right? We connect neurons that are, that represent different topics or subjects that we know, like things like information that we've gathered, and we build connections between them based on our experiences. Ooh, I love this. I think of the song from Encanto. Yes. Oh, now that's going to be stuck in my head all day, Sean. But not a
What
bad
types
song to
of
be stuck in my head.
I love that.
Ooh,
So
types of
now
noodles. That sounds fun and tasty. I need lunch. Should have had lunch.
now that we've had
Oh,
unquote, now that we've had some time to fill out your mind map, drop in the chat. What did you put in your mind map? Meanwhile, we'll show you what we put together for today. And so our mind map includes caterpillars, cocoons, migratory, right? Because monarch butterflies, there's other butterflies too that are migratory, pollinators, colorful nectar. And I'm sure there's like a million and one other things that you can probably add to this mind map, but you can hopefully start to see how this can get kids started to be excited about the subject. And I love all the suggestions in the chat, right? To introduce it with a song, or to, the very hungry caterpillar as a way to introduce this whole subject, this whole unit. What a great way to get kids excited. And so if there are other things that you're doing in your programs, if you're, working on life cycle with pasta noodles, drop it in the chat. We love to see your ideas about how you are getting students excited about the content in your programs. That all said, we are going to move from engage into our next phase, which is explore. So in this phase, the exploration phase, this is where we begin to dive into the hands-on aspects of learning. It's great for science. It makes a lot of sense. And in science, Specifically, this exploration phase is typically characterized by lab work. And we can refer to various activities as labs and still use this idea of exploration embedded into the activity. So there are three specific things you want to keep in mind with building activities to support the exploration phase. We want to make sure that we're developing specific skills. So every field has specific skills and practices that students need to be successful. Students should develop knowledge and practices such as effective research skills, laboratory procedures, or reading for information. There's another way that everything's starting to connect, right? Reading for information within the activity that's more of a science-based thing, we're supporting literacy skills. And so you can start to see how everything's can support each other, right? If you integrate it. We also want to make sure that we establish a common base of knowledge. So collaborative learning is most effective when students have a shared vocabulary and understanding of the topic. And then we also want to make sure that we are facilitating active exploration in the activity. So students should engage with the topic, right? We think about that hands-on aspect. All work, labs, case studies, whatever it is that you're planning should be student-centered and inquiry-led. And so an example for you, it's also kind of science-based, is weather data collection exploration activity, right? So you take time over the course of the week and have students collect and record weather data. So that could include things like temperature, humidity, wind speed, precipitation, and think about geographically where you are and how unique that might be from somewhere else in the world, right? And have them use that data then to look for patterns, identify patterns, and make predictions about the future weather conditions. Fun little science activity. There's so many other things that you can incorporate into this, especially if it's more of a long-term unit of study. Think about, all the math skills they could be building with the different aspects of measuring, right? There's just so much possibility here.
There's so
If
much,
you
even sequencing and stuff. Like it
right,
supports so many different skills. I love this activity.
the water cycle, there's so many things, right? If you have other ideas of great exploration activities that you've done in your programs, then drop them in the chat. We'd love to see those from you. Let's take a look though at some other sample exploration activities. And I kind of want to ask you to take a look at these and figure out which one does not support exploration. So we've got 4 different activities here. We have the zombie apocalypse, where students are presented with a fictional disease outbreak scenario and a set of clues, and they must work to determine the cause of the outbreak and propose a solution. Our second activity option is rebuilding the key bridge, where students are tasked with rebuilding the key bridge and must consider factors such as load-bearing capacities and stability and testing their designs and faults in the original design. Our third activity option is cell structure overview. So students are going to complete a reading on the different parts of the cell and their functions. They'll then complete a diagram worksheet followed by a Q&A with their facilitator. And our fourth activity option is a personal ecosystem. So the students are going to create a small ecosystem in a jar using materials gathered from outside. And over time, they will observe the interactions and make predictions about how the ecosystem is developing within their jar. So 4 activities, and I can tell you something is not really supporting exploration. But what do you think? Drop us in the chat. Which one of these activities strikes you as not fitting exploration? Carrie says
Ooh.
that the cell structure activity could be way better. I love how you said that. I would tend to agree. Chaz, what do you think?
Yeah, yeah, and I also love the verbiage on it, right? Could be better. It's not that it's a bad activity, right? It's a good start. but there are definitely ways that we can build on that activity and make it more interactive with the students. I honestly, my favorite cell structure activity that I've ever done is we made little like cakes basically that were in the shapes and forms of cells. So you have a bunch of like tasty but fairly nutritious things that you can put together, and then you have like either the round structure of like an animal cell, or you have the box structure of a plant cell. And you have people put in different things that represent different parts of the cell structure. Something that like has them, being hands-on and really starting to interact and understand the different parts of the activity.
Yeah, I absolutely love that. And that's exactly what this needs, right? As it is right now, it feels very school day. It feels very seventh grade science class. Um, you want to get outside of the box. You want to do things that are going to get them hands on. And I love the idea of them being able to manipulate and kind of build in this exploration phase. That's a great suggestion for how to change this activity to make it more hands-on, Chaz. Thank you. Thank you for that. Okay,
Mhm.
so we've done engage, we have explored, and now we're going to move on to explain. So during the explanation phase, uh, you as the facilitator of the activities has to share information that students cannot demonstrate on their own, right? You're also going to correct any misassumptions, misconceptions, and support that cognitive processing of the information. Research research has shown that minimal guidance during instruction is significantly less effective and efficient than guidance specifically designed to support the cognitive processing necessary for learning. And so in this explanation phase, it is necessary that we maximize learning. And so we can do that by clarifying the essential facts, making sure that students really understand the important facts that underlie the subject. And some strategies you might try could be things like graphic organizers, guided notes, or informational texts. You also want to describe observations. So students and you as the facilitator work together to describe and make sense of observations made during the exploration phase. You as the facilitator might guide students to interpret the data or notice patterns or draw connections between their hands-on experiences and those underlying concepts. We also, within this phase, are going to reflect on learning. And so reflecting on learning involves looking back at what has been learned, connecting it to the prior knowledge that we have, and then considering how it fits into the broader context of that subject. So you as the facilitator would encourage students to think critically about their learning process and the content that they've explored. So an example activity for you might be something like progressive problem solving. And so this is where you would guide students step by step, then move from solving problems together to solving problems with hints. Finally, students would then apply what they've learned independently. And so there's a space within this activity where you are explaining. And that's where this phase is going to support and maximize student learning. So let's take a look at some more examples of activities, right? And so this is actually broken down by those three things: clarifying the essential facts, describing observations, and reflecting on the learning that has taken place. And so each little activity here supports each of those. For clarifying essential facts, our activity is to discuss the key concepts of ecosystems, including the water cycle, the role of producers, consumers, and decomposers, and the importance of balance. And so this is kind of the explanation phase following that personal ecosystem in a jar activity from our exploration phase. We will also describe our observations. So this could look like leading a discussion where students are going to have that opportunity to describe their observations over time in their personal ecosystem in a jar. And this could include things like changes in the plant growth or the moisture level or condensation. And then we have reflection on that learning that they've done, right? And we want to prompt students to reflect on what they've learned about ecosystems, both in the context of the jar that their personal ecosystem jar, but also in the broader environment. And this also might look a little different depending on your geographic location. Think about all the different kinds of ecosystems that you can introduce, right? And talking about, think about programs out in Arizona look very different than programs over in Maine, just because of geographic location, right? And so there's another layer in what can be taught and learned around the concept of ecosystems. Okay, so engage, explore, explain. After explain comes extend. And this is where they're going to be taking whatever they've been working on, all the learning that has taken thus far, and expand it further and make connections to the world around them. This is whenever they start to look at ecosystems around the world, around the United States, in other areas, right? Looking at just the different types of ecosystems, just to continue our example of that activity. So this whole step is about using specific activities that were done and then having students identify how their new knowledge connects to other topics beyond and going out into the real world. So some of the things we want to make sure that we're thinking about is that we are applying it to the real world, right? Students should extend their learning past what is taught in the classroom and in your OST spaces. And we want to help them to understand the connections to the other topics, right? We also are deepening understanding. So students should continue to study that topic and gain additional practice and skills. Activities could include more experiments, independent practice, student-led inquiry, anything that's going to take them to that next step, right? The beyond the initial learning process. So here's an example for you. This is not about our ecosystem. Entrepreneurship challenge. So students in groups take a business idea where they apply basic math skills to calculate income, expenses, savings, and percentages, as if they were being an entrepreneur themselves, right? So lots of great activity ideas, but going back to our ecosystem, so just let's see how this connects beyond the first three phases, right? How are we taking this into extend? So I want you to take a moment and think about this ecosystem example and how you might deepen understanding and apply learning to the real world. If you have an idea of what you might do if this was your activity plan, where would you go from here? What other things are you thinking about that you could use to extend that learning for students? Do you have any ideas, Chaz?
Yeah, I do. Back in my English teacher days, I worked a lot with our science teachers. Like we worked in little cohorts, and so we tried to sort of co-plan the things that we were going to do. And so when the science teacher started going over ecosystem stuff, we started doing research into actually like damaged ecosystems, right? And so our students and my students ended up writing letters that were appeals, right? So it's still an English topic, right? Because we're still trying to, engage people and it's an emotional appeal type of essay, but you're also using the research and data that you gathered in your science class to write to some conservation agency or something like that as an appeal to, save this. The one that always springs to mind is the hellbender salamander that is in the Southwest that is incredibly endangered, but a really fascinating creature. And it's interesting just how much passion that ends up sparking with students once you start making those connections with the real world. You're not just like, oh, okay, that's an ecosystem in a jar. It's like, no, wait, our whole world is basically an ecosystem in a jar, right? And so let's take a look at how we can engage with that. And even starting from whatever age, how you can start to positively affect those things too. So it just rolls out into so many other incredible things once you start making those real world connections.
Yeah, absolutely. As we continue to think about this, I want to ask our folks in our attendees to let us know in the chat how you are supporting real world application, regardless of whether it's the ecosystem example here or not. How are you doing that within the context of your own program? It could be so many things, and we'd love to hear from you about the things that you've tried and thinking about. How do I make this real for my students, right? So here's our example of how we might extend this learning. So students would then research a real world ecosystem that has been damaged and create a proposal for its restoration. Chaz, it kind of reminds me of what you were just sharing, right?
It's funny because I legitimately forgot that this was the example, and then I'm reading over the slide. I'm like, oh, okay, that's okay, great, yeah. Well, good to know that that's something positive that I did in the classroom. Good, it
Yeah.
aligns.
And we can take it even further and make sure that students are thinking about, all the different aspects, right? The species diversity, the human impact, the sustainability of the environment. All of these things are great ways to start to get kids digging deeper around the real world application around ecosystems. I also can't help but reflect. I remember, and I can't recall what grade it was now, but I just remember being so gung ho about the terrarium that we made in class that I went home and I made one. Um,
Yeah,
well, my woeful parents with
just
a very green soda bottle. But but you know what? That it was that experience in the learning space that sparked curiosity and interest and intrigue, and then I decided to just do it at home. That can also be your
absolutely.
students too, right? You have such a wonderful opportunity to instill that curiosity, get them asking questions and experimenting and extending that learning into their the real world around them. So, okay, so that was four, right? We had engage, we had explore, we had explain, we had extend. So now we quickly are approaching evaluate, which is our fifth E. And we do a lot of evaluating in our spaces, right? Especially when we are talking about those SMART goals and we have to measure something, right? And we want to be able to show that all this work that we're doing, all this planning, all these activities, we have to have some way of determining if it's had the intended impact on student progress. And so when we think about this phase, the evaluation phase, this is where we're going to have students answer the questions they formulated at the beginning and give them the opportunity to demonstrate their new knowledge and the skills that they've developed. And so this is assessing for understanding, right? And that could be, yes, pre-post tests, as we saw in our sample SMART goals, but it could be so much more. We can have students assessing their own learning, which is such an important step too, right? Because it's reflective in a way, right? For them to look back and kind of grade themselves, so to speak, right, on their own learning. It also gives them the opportunity to celebrate the achievements that they've made and also identify gaps in understanding. For them to be able to have the opportunity to identify those things, to call them out for themselves is incredibly valuable. It's not just us as the facilitators and the instructors and the teachers to say that, oh, well, you need to work on X, Y, and Z. For a student to be able to also identify, like, I need to work on these things is incredibly valuable.
I think
So
that's
some
such a
other
powerful
things.
thing,
No,
that
go ahead.
metacognitive piece. Just having students think about the way that they're thinking and learning is such a powerful tool to give students, and the earlier the better, right? Because we all learn and assess and evaluate information differently. So the sooner we become accustomed to the way in which we do that and we modify the way that we are engaging with material for that, the better we are as students and just the better we are as people. It's an incredibly powerful skill, and I think it's a skill that a lot of adults haven't taken the time to, assess. So I think it's incredible to be able to instill that in students through this process.
Oh, 100%. And I'm with you on the adult piece. Like there's, I have seen even in my own experience where that was missing in
Hmm.
my formative years, and how impactful having that opportunity to self-assess could have been, right? Um, so there's so many activities that you can do to support this. It's more than just pre-post tests. It's more than just, giving them some kind of assessment in a way. But it could look like, a closing discussion circle or a reflective writing piece or that KWL chart that you started off in the engaging phase. Revisit that and what you thought, what you wondered. Did you find the answers to that? What did you learn as part of this process? Revisiting that KWL chart and reflecting back on the experience can be very valuable. And ultimately, we're measuring student progress, right? That's how we're going to say that we met our goal or we almost met our goal or, oh, we missed the mark, because sometimes that happens and it's okay, but we need to adjust in those moments, right? And so this is whenever you, as that facilitator, as the instructor, are going to take the time to really review the student progress and compare what students did to the initial goal aligned standard. So looking at your SMART goal, making the comparison between your data here at the end of the whole unit. And so, yes, this could be your assessments. It could be a rubric. Or it could be some way that students are exhibiting the learning that they've done. So here's an example. I love this example. It's called Lit Talk Reflections. So before I describe it, just know that TikTok and social media is a hot topic, and it might not be
Hmm.
right for your space, right? But there are ways that you could adjust this so that it's, using a video software that comes on the devices available in your program. It does not have to be actually on social media. We want to make sure that we're ensuring student safety and we're following the protocols and the rules of our programs, right? But essentially, this activity is where students are taking that idea of a TikTok, right, and creating short video reflection using vocabulary words during a literacy activity. So they would take time within the video to explain the meaning, provide examples, and maybe even act them out in kind of like a short skit. What a great way to take kind of that vocabulary spelling test, not so exciting, engaging activity, and turn it on its head and make it something that like really resonates with kids and they get excited about. So that's just one idea for you. But now that we have gone through these 5 E's, I want to spend some time thinking about building out a final activity for our ecosystem unit that we've keep touching back on, right? So I want you to think about what ideas do you have to help students demonstrate their knowledge on this unit about the ecosystem? Scratch your head a little bit, be creative. There are no wrong answers. We're just brainstorming together here. What do you think might be a neat way to support the evaluation phase around the unit on ecosystems?
something that springs to mind to me right now, and kind of like it can feel old school, but there are so many like new and interactive ways that you can do it is through dioramas, right? Like that's something that people don't do very much anymore. It's sort of fallen out of vogue, but I think you can really build out some cool dioramas, especially when it comes to doing something as involved as the ecosystem. And you can have interactive elements in it. You can have technological elements in it. You have a little smartphone in the back. You can have little crickets chirping. Like all types of things that you could do. Just seems like a fun thing that's hands-on, gets them, creatively engaging with the topic in a way that they might not have otherwise.
I love that. And what a cool way to also thinking about that kind of, environmental advocacy, using recycled products for their diagram,
That's right.
right? Bring
Mhm.
in, the recycles that you've got at home, or maybe you do a collection within your program space for recyclable materials to help build out that diorama. What a cool idea. I also like I am an artist at heart. I was a music major. I taught music for several years. Musical theater was my shtick. Like, what if they created a play about an ecosystem
Mm,
to have
I love
them,
that.
take a real world problem and create a story around it and put it on as a show to create this advocacy and this like awareness around a particular subject that they care deeply about. So I think about, okay, yes, I have my coffee here and my reusable straw, which has been the straws over the past few years, man. They are, I think about the sea turtles. They could do a play about sea turtles and saving, the fish and using recyclable straws. There's so many things that they could do. And it's just let them also be creative and share their own ideas around what they want to do to be able to get through this like final phase and evaluate. You have to figure out how you're going to evaluate it if they help inform the activity, but you're incorporating student voice and choice. You are allowing them to show their learning in a way that they feel comfortable and confident. There's so many neat things that you could do, and you might not be working on an ecosystem unit. You might be working on some math, but there's bound to be really cool and creative ways that you can support whatever the subject is that you're working towards in this evaluate phase.
Absolutely.
So
And your kids will really surprise you too. I mean, it's not just up to you to think about those creative ways to evaluate, right? So listening to the student voice and then instead of just being like, no, that's difficult. Let's not do that. Sort of doing the improv yes and like, oh, okay, so that's a cool idea. What if we did this? Like what if we spun it this way so that it's something that we can actually do in class? And it's not just a way to make students feel heard, but a way that they feel like they're taking possession of their own learning. And that makes it so much more impactful for a student.
I also thinking about the story you shared about the salamander, Chaz.
Mm,
What if there's a local, concern or something that they can like write to their, their state representative or, an organization that they can support that is working towards, solving some kind of environmental problem. That letter writing is a way to incorporate literacy into this, which is fantastic and a skill that they'll take on, into their future. So here's another example for you of another idea. They kind of it shares a lot of similarities to some of the things we shared, but this one's called Documentary Now, and this evaluation activity is an opportunity for students to use some technology. They would research that local environmental concern and develop a script and film their own documentary, edit the whole works to promote community awareness around that topic. And so regardless of what these activities are, you might be thinking, well, how do I gather data on this phase, how do I measure the impact on student growth and success in this format, right? It's so much easier to just give a test. Um, so there's lots of ways that we can assess student understanding. I think for many of the examples we shared, a rubric would be the first step, right, to support that measuring process of growth and success. Because on a rubric, you can lay out the different elements of what they were supposed to learn and measurable outcomes for each of those, right? And on a scale. And let's say it is this documentary now. Maybe it's not very well filmed. Maybe it's, you know, a little discombobulated, but maybe the message comes across, you know. All of that will affect kind of the way that you're scaling the grade, the assessment of the final product that the students put together. Chaz, do you have any other ideas for how we might measure student growth in this way?
I mean, I think that there's space for sort of a not just your rubric, but also sort of a peer review rubric, right? Where students like you give them a rubric and you say, okay, well, we're going to watch everybody else's videos, right? And so now you're going to apply these to what we're looking at right now, and so it's a good way for students to take a step back and self-assess their own creative process in that way, and providing them with the opportunity for that sort of analysis just helps them moving forward when it comes to, you know, figuring out what's being asked of me, how I can adapt that to my learning style, and you know, how it can be most impactful.
I love a good peer review. I don't think enough of that
Hmm.
happens either, you know, to be able
Yeah.
to have students take the opportunity to look at each other's work and think critically about it, and the skill of providing feedback to your peers.
Yes. Yeah.
I mean,
Valuable
what an
soft skill
opportunity.
that does not get supported very often, right? And so, and that's what a number of these different evaluation methods, they don't just support, you know, the student getting a grade or the student doing better in this one specific area, but they're also tangential and support other aspects of student growth that may not necessarily be your target here, right? Students grow in many different directions at the same time. I know when
Absolutely.
we did this whole documentary thing, we did a fun sort of film festival as sort of a like family engagement activity afterwards. So we had, you know, parents come in, we had some light refreshments or whatever, and you know, we all got to sit and watch these fun videos that the students had made. And I'll never forget one where they did it in the form of a Steve Irwin nature documentary, complete with the Australian accent, which was awful, but in the best way, if you know what I
Yeah. I love that. And you know,
mean.
I'm glad you shared that because that there we go with the family engagement piece. Like we have
Yeah.
now
Yep.
connected to yet another activity that we need to be thinking about in our 21st century programs. And with a culminating activity like a documentary to bring student families in for a viewing party, that's awesome. I love that. So, so many great ideas. I have
Mm.
just, I love this. But I want to go back to some of our examples from earlier. If you can think before we even dove into the 5 E's, even we saw some of this data where we understand that students, 38% of students met state standards for math assessments. Um, and that's not a super number. It's a pretty low percentage.
Could be
But
better.
we also know that they are specifically having trouble with fractions and percentages. So having that little nugget of extra detail is really going to be helpful as we think about activities in each of these phases to support their learning in those areas. We also know that they are interested in a couple different um, they don't seem like they're connected at all. Uh, Subjects: medieval history, R&B, and video games. So we did some brainstorming and thought about these 5 E's and what could we possibly do for activities to support work around fractions and percentages, but also tapping in to the specific interests of the students. And so here's what we came up with. This is a whole unit, and it has been designed to integrate those student interests into the medieval history with those specific math skills. And so for each phase of the 5E model, we came up with just some very short descriptions around some activities where students can build and apply their understanding of fractions and percentages and address those areas that they struggle with, while still making sure that it's highly engaging and connected to their interests. So for engage, a market day auction. And so this activity is a simulation. So students would participate in a simulated medieval market using medieval currency to purchase supplies. And this is a short description, but we could elaborate further and have them consider, how much change do they have after a purchase, and do they have enough to make another purchase, right? And does it have to actually be medieval currency? Not necessarily. You could use monopoly money, but the idea is that they are looking at the money that they do have and figuring out how much they've spent and looking at those, thinking about cents, right, and the decimals. And then we move from this engage where they're starting to just kind of dabble in this theme and in the skill set, and moving into the exploration phase. And so this is where students would write a song in the style of the era, focusing on rhythm and beats. So being a musical person, it goes without saying, music and math align. And so this is a really great way for them to start to explore some of those mathematical aspects, right? Particularly as it pertains to rhythm. Then we move from the exploration phase into explain phase. And so here's where we have students calculating the percentage of the taxes owed to the king based on income and goods of the people. This is a kind of a life skill in a way, right? We all grow up and eventually have to pay taxes. And so there's an element of this that will connect to the real world, but there's a lot of explanation that has to happen here. Because this is a concept that requires a lot of support, understanding of percentages, and a little bit of that phased instruction, right? You do it with the students, and little by little, you do less and less and let them work on their own. And then from explain, we move into extend, which is where we're, giving them opportunities to take it into more of a real world context. And so here we'll have students design castle blueprints. And so they're looking at square footage, they're looking at area, they're looking at perimeter. And then we finally move into our last E, the evaluate phase. And here we're going to be working on a strategy where students are to defend themselves from invaders, assessing their resources, their stockpiles, and the chances of repair and rebuilding. Again, very short descriptions for you for some of these activities, but hopefully you can start to see how they connect to the E that they are associated with, right? But also directly with the student voice and student needs. It sounds like a fun unit to me. I don't know about you, Jazz.
I mean, I think it sounds like a really fun unit, and I think it's important to pay attention to how fractions and percentages, which are again the target that we're trying to support, right, are sort of baked into each one of these activities. Not in a way where it feels like, oh, okay, I'm sitting here in a fraction lesson. It's like, no, I have to make sure I get all of the grain and I need to buy a sheep and I need to, whatever at market day, but I only have this much money. So, and the sheep costs this much more than grain, and then the sheep eats the grain. Like, there are all types of things, right? Like, and I think it's incredible just how engaging these activities can be if you, and I don't want to say don't focus on the goal, right? Because you are focusing on the goal, but you're not highlighting the goal or the target. You're sort of hiding it behind the scenes as you create engaging activities that make students uh, access material in ways that they might not have thought of before, from a different perspective.
Yeah, it's almost like they're going that these activities support learning in ways that they don't necessarily know that they're learning, right? Because
That's right.
there's an element of gameplay, right, in the siege strategy. And it's not that we're consciously aware of the skills that we're working on in that gameplay kind of activity. We're playing the game. But we've also had to do all that work to get to that place where we can play the game and utilize the skills that we've built on fractions and percentages.
Absolutely. I
Um,
think it's also good to note that um, while some of these activities might seem challenging for students who are already struggling with fractions and percentages, you can use instructional strategies to help support them, right? Like Brittany was saying, we could do I do, we do's, you do's. You could also do scaffolded activities, right? So you could start with a lot of support for these activities and then slowly remove them as the students start to like independently interact with the material. And I think particularly for things like the taxes activity, I think that could be really useful and impactful, helping students feel like they're capable of engaging with the material before you sort of like set them loose on their own.
yeah, and I think that for those who are here with us today, this definitely feels like middle school and higher, probably, right? And this is just an example. We put this together just to try to picture for you how this all comes together. But it will certainly look different based on what your students' needs are, what your student voice is like. They may be interested in other things and they may have different needs. But thinking about these 5 E's and that 3-phase process that we introduced at the beginning is going to help you build intentional activities to support those specific needs and student voice. So as we think about applying the 5 E's in every context, right? You have done the work to plan a series of activities aligned with the 5 E's, but we don't always have the time to implement them. What can you do if you need to implement an effective lesson on short notice or in a standalone context? We'd love to hear from you in the chat. How can you apply the principles of the 5 E's when you have limited planning time?
I
What do
think
you
this
think,
is
Chaz?
a I think it's a really valuable question to ask, particularly in out of school time, where y- you you're not just you don't might not have the time to sit down and plan collaboratively with your whole group. So sometimes you might have to do these things on the fly. Also, we all know at out of school time, um, topics come up just organically, through interactions with the students, and we're like, oh, that would be a great way to address this thing that I was thinking about how to address. Okay, let's just start building that out right now. And what I really love doing in times like that is even just doing like when you're talking about evaluating student voice and interest, you could do just like a quick straw poll of the kids that you have there. Be like, hey, listen, like we're out here looking at this cool caterpillar. How many of you actually know about like the whole gestation cycle of a caterpillar? Like, are we clear about that? Do we know how that works? No. Okay. Well, there's some gaps in understanding here. well, let's start putting together something, just like on the fly. Let's think about what we could do to engage with you right now. And then, moving forward, once you've done sort of that, you've gotten that hook, right? You've gotten the engage it out of the way, then you can start to build that out later, right? So sometimes, especially in out of school context, our planning sort of happens after the fact, after the initial impact, just because of the nature of the beast.
Yeah. And I'm sure folks are thinking about other challenges that um, are going to be impacting how you approach planning, whether it's with the 5E model or a different instructional model. But I'm thinking of like the moments whenever there's that, you know, um, it's not a real fire, but golly, it almost is, situations or a staffing shortage and you're a program manager and you're not usually in front of students. You have facilitators that you have in place for that, but oh my gosh, the flu is swiping through your building and you're down a bunch of teachers and you have to be in front of students. um, there's always going to be this moment, and we do have to be able to still support student learning and do the job, right? um, but I'm thinking about this next question about what skills do people need to develop to practice the 5E instructional model. And for me, I think one of the biggest things is like I had to learn how to write a plan. I had to learn how to write down the steps, um, so that I could effectively facilitate a lesson before I became comfortable with facilitating lessons.
Hmm.
Um, and that is a really hard thing to teach people, especially if they don't necessarily come to us with a background in education, or
Yeah.
sometimes they haven't had that experience with developing um, you know teaching models or utilizing teaching models.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
so being able to write it down, and that might have to come from a higher up as a support to somebody else.
Yeah, right. Your program director might be able to scaffold that for you. Like, here's how, this plan could look. So how, and then you use it, and then eventually you get comfortable enough with it that you can do it yourself. As somebody who came from like a traditional teacher education background, it was sort of the opposite for me. I was pretty good with writing the plans, but I wasn't great at being flexible with them, right? Like
Mm,
I would get in there and be like, "Oh, okay, here's what we're going to do." And then, obstacle A is presented or another option is presented and it's a really good option, right? But in my brain I'm going, "Yeah, but that's not my plan." Right? So, let's stick to my plan. Okay? Maybe. And that's not necessarily a useful way, especially in out of school time programming. It's not necessarily the most useful way to engage students, right? Because it feels like you're shutting down that student voice. So for me, learning how to be flexible in those moments, how to pivot and be adaptable was an invaluable skill.
yeah. Yeah, because regardless of what's written down, sometimes you have to have to
Yeah.
pivot.
Yeah. No plan survives the first 5 minutes, right? In front of kids. It just changes. It has to.
Um, there is so much that we could go on about, but I am realizing, Chaz, that we are at the end of our time. So as we start to come to a close, folks, I just want to leave you with um, just a question to think about. Um, when implementing instructional models, utilizing something like the 5Es, um, how do you plan to change your activity planning or implementation based on what we've talked about today? We'd love to hear from you in the chat if you have any ideas rolling around in your head about how you might adjust based on the information we shared today. But we also want to take a moment to send you a link to a feedback form. As Chaz mentioned, a lot of the content that we do here within the NTAC is all based on participant feedback. and you sharing with us the specific needs that you have within your programs. And so if you could take a moment and fill out the survey, which is dropped in the chat for you, we would be very grateful. We take it very seriously, and we build out content based on what we learn from these, from feedback from you. We also have on the screen for you ways to connect with us if you're interested in learning more or getting to know us better. You can visit our website at 21stcclcntac.org. This webinar will be in our archives. Turnaround time is about 2 weeks. So if you go looking for it, just give us a couple days. You can also check out our newsletter, which comes out once a month. You can sign up using the QR code there. Also, check us out on LinkedIn and X. The newsletter is the best way to keep in touch with all the upcoming webinars and trainings that we have to offer. And so we hope to see you again at another one soon. The calendar is full for September and October, so I'm sure our paths will cross again. Chaz, thanks for presenting with me today. It's been a pleasure.
Absolutely. Always a great time, Brittany.
Thank you all again. Take a moment to fill out that survey for us, and we'll see you next time.